Tell me what it's like to be back in your original hometown.
Hard to describe, truthfully, particularly after all these years. I graduated from Chattanooga High School in 1940.
The school building is still here, it just has a different name. Chattanooga School for the Arts and Sciences, or CSAS. That's where I had the privilege to talk to Major John Lucky Luckadoo.
I'm so pleased that the facility, the edifice, is still here and still being utilized after all of these many, many years. These old walls have seen a phenomenal number of people to migrate through them in the years that they've been in existence, and this is an institution really that is unique. I think there are very few comparable situations throughout the country that high schools or buildings like this have served their purpose and are still being utilized, certainly to the degree that this one is. So it's nostalgic, of course, to go back to your roots and to revisit places that you grew up in, and particularly so many, many years ago.
Which part of town did you grow up in?
Well, I grew up on Missionary Ridge, and we lived on the side of the ridge, on the south side of the ridge.
He wrote this book, Damn Lucky, with author Kevin Mallett. The book says Lucky went to grade school on Missionary Ridge in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Today, there are brownstones in the location the school stood on the ridge. And the book says, even back then, he, quote, dreamed of being a soldier marching into battle. Missionary Ridge is the location of a historic Civil War battle. Lucky studied these tablets that tell the stories of the movements and strategies of the Civil War armies.
And I went to junior high school at Dickinson, and then to Brainerd, and then came here to my final 2 years where I graduated in 1940. And of course, I am here for this weekend to install a cinemagraph for my dear friend that I graduated here from. We had an ROTC unit here in Chattanooga High School then, a regiment, and my friend Sully Sullivan was the regimental commander. We had two battalions, and I commanded one of the two battalions under him. But we graduated together in 40, and then both enrolled in the University of Chattanooga, which in those days was an independent liberal arts college. There were only about 500 students in the whole school at that time. Later, of course, became a part of the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, but in those days it was independent.
Yeah. So were you in school there when Pearl Harbor happened?
I was. When Sully and I graduated here from school, from high school, in 1940, it was prior to Pearl Harbor, and the Battle of Britain was raging in Europe, and we knew or had strong feelings that America would ultimately become involved, although that was a European war at that time and did not involve the U.S. because the citizenry of the U.S. were not sympathetic to that war. And they had been through World War I, which ended in 1918, and that was just a few years prior to the European War in Europe was commencing, and at that time Germany had occupied all of continental Europe, and so that was on the other side of the world. And President Roosevelt, at the time, although very sympathetic to the cause of allying with Great Britain against the Germans and the Third Reich's blitzkrieg of all of the nations in that part of the world and threatening to invade England in the British Isles. If he had been successful in doing that, that would just have been the next step to hopping over to our eastern shores. And so we were vulnerable, and as a consequence, Sully and I, who we were 18 and 19 years old at the time, thought, well, the wisest thing we could do, since we both wanted to learn to fly, was to go to Canada and join the Royal Canadian Air Force and get our training, and then if and when America became embroiled, then we could transfer to what was then the United States Army Air Corps. And we'd be a step ahead of our contemporaries because we could transfer back then to the Air Corps. However, because we were underage, it naturally required parental consent. And Sully was an only child of a single mother and whose father had died as a result of injuries in World War I. And he never knew his father. And so when we proposed that we do this, she was very hesitant and thoughtful about it, but she said, well, if you told Sully that if he really felt that that was what he should do, that he would have her blessing. And I went home thinking that that would probably be the reaction that I would get from my parents. But when my mother learned that Mrs. Sullivan had agreed to allow her only child to go ahead and pre-train in Canada, she said, well, I won't stand in your way, but you will have to convince your father. And he had an entirely different perspective. He thought it was idiotic and impulsive and ridiculous. And he refused to give his permission. So as a consequence, Sully went on to Canada and was trained and participated in the Egyptian campaign and the North African campaign, flying Spitfires for the Royal Canadian Air Force. In the meantime, I was in the University of Chattanooga, and when Pearl Harbor occurred, and there was no question at that point that I was going to be either drafted or conscripted, or if I volunteered, I could select the branch of service that I would be enlisted in. And so I chose the Air Force and went through training, and in the meantime, Sully finished up the African campaign and was transferred to England. I ended up being assigned to a heavy bomber group and posted in England. So we got together over there eventually and visited each other, and that was very nostalgic too, because we were very close friends. And I was delighted to see that he had survived the war that he had been involved in, and certainly had no idea as to whether I would survive the war I was now involved in, because we went to war grossly unprepared. We were citizen soldiers that were suddenly enlisted into combatants, and they took 40 from my class, graduating class in flying school, 40 of us, and sent us to this one bomb group. It was the only group that they did this to, and replaced us with all of the co-pilots in the group. And we were assigned to a B-17 organization that had 48 crews of 10 men apiece. And as the co-pilot, we became the second in command of each crew. But we had not been through the pre-combat training that all of the others of the group had. And so we were met with mixed reactions, I can assure you. And the crew that I was assigned to, the navigator and the bombardier, were the two other officers on the crew, had been very close to their co-pilot that I replaced. And they were embittered, literally, with my taking his place. And they proceeded to make my life hell, do everything they could to discourage me from staying on the crew. I don't know what they thought they'd get in my place, but nevertheless, that was their attitude and their reaction, and the experience that I had or reception that I got from the rest of the crew. And so going to war and having to police your backfield is not the wisest thing or the happiest thing that you can imagine. But prior to being sent over, our commander called us together, and he said, now I want you to look to your right, and you look to your left, and look ahead and look behind you, and only one of you is going to come home. So you're going to be killed, and you might as well accept it. That's the way we went to war. But we were having to learn, as the new members of these crews, our jobs on the job as we were doing it. And we flew our own airplanes across the North Atlantic to the combat zone. And we were suddenly going up against a very formidable, professional German Air Force that had been fighting for 4 years. And they knew what they were doing. And they did it extremely well. They were well equipped, but they were so experienced. And we were not. So we were suddenly confronted with a situation where we had to grow up in a hurry, overnight.
I don't take up too much of your time, so I'll ask you one more question. Clearly, with the book and Masters of Air, your story and the people you were there with story is being told in, a very big way. What do you hope people take away from this story as they see it and read it and these things?
Well, the series actually focused on personalities. We had some rather flamboyant members of the organization. They were good pilots, but they were highlighted, and the series told a story in 9 episodes of what kind of people they were and what they experienced if they were shot down and ended up in POW camps, which fortunately I did not. So I had no knowledge personally of what it was like to be incarcerated. Of the 40 of us that came from my flying school class to the 100th Bomb Group, which became known as the Bloody Hundredth because of our horrendous losses, some of which were attributable to the fact that we were being thrown into combat totally unprepared, was that 4 of us out of the 40 actually lived to complete a tour, combat tour of 25 missions at that time. It eventually was raised to ultimately to 30 and then 35 and eventually 50 by the end of the war. But our chances of survival were something that we couldn't contemplate or allow ourselves to be too concerned about, because if you did, you'd probably crack up and not be able to do the job that you were sent to do. But we soon discovered that we didn't have one enemy, but we had 4. First were the fighters, who were very experienced. And the second was our fear. We were literally scared to death because we didn't know what we were going to be confronted with. The third was the flak. Their anti-aircraft defenses were highly developed, and so in numbers that they were very effective. Half of our losses out of daylight, high-altitude bombing were due to flak. But the last and probably the most important one was freezing. We were flying at 25 to 29,000 feet in unpressurized, heavy 4-engine aircraft. Temperatures of minus 50 to 60 degrees below zero. And that so seriously impacted our ability to function that it was amazing. As a matter of fact, if you removed your glove at that altitude, your fingers could self-amputate to the knuckles. You wouldn't see any pain or feel any pain or see any blood or have any sensation at all. You just see your fingers lying on the floor. But ironically, in the heat of battle, when all hell was breaking loose, some fighters are coming in, the flak is coming up, and you can hear it hitting on the fuselage, and you see your friends going down in flames. And you suddenly are discovering you're perspiring profusely. And that perspiration freezes instantly. And what it did was it blocked our oxygen flow, which we had to have above 10,000 feet or we couldn't exist. So you ended up cracking up ice with one hand and flying the airplane with the other. But I frequently get asked, well, having that experience and getting back and knowing that you had to get back in that airplane the next day and go do the same thing. And sadly enough, our bombing accuracy was very minimal. We didn't come within 9 miles of the target 25% of the time, which meant we had to go back day after day after the same targets. And of course, they were much better defended when we did that. So those were the kind of things that the series, Masters of the Air, was trying to convey. But they were focusing on the personalities of individuals in our group. Now, at the end of the series, Tom Hanks did an epilogue entitled The Bloody Hundredth, which was the 10th hour of the series. And in that, he took excerpts from the interviews like my own of those of us who were actually there and experienced what they were trying to convey. And that literally told the story of what the Bloody Hundredth did and accomplished in the 2-year span that it was in combat. Better than the 9 episodes. So I don't want to be critical of what they did because they had reasons for it. But I had certainly during the course of interviews that I had with writers and filmmakers during the course of the production, made them aware of these things that happened to the group that did not happen to any other group, such as replacing all the co-pilots. And that was never even mentioned there, even though it was a glorious opportunity to document it. It should have been documented. So I did it in the book that I wrote called Damn Lucky. And I didn't mean to be profane in selecting that title, but I just meant that I was incredibly fortunate under all of those adverse circumstances to be a survivor. I'm no hero, I'm a survivor. And if you live through what we did, you are just a survivor. So I spend my time currently lecturing to school children and younger generations, other groups that weren't even born then, such as yours, as to what our generation did and why we did it and how we did it, or none of us would be here.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's my honor.